Okay, so that was a lot of explanation, and we got into a lot of detail. And I will say that that's probably the most complex thing we'll go through in the class. So hopefully that comforts some of you. So to try to hopefully bring this to a conclusion and see if some of this has sunk in, I want to come back to one more example that's very, very similar to the example we just looked at. And I want to use the example that you went through in your Xi book, where they talked about two different base class of generic item that just represents something you keep track of in your inventory. So an item that has a name and a quantity, right? There's the two variables that they put at the bottom of the class in this case. So a name and a quantity. And then you have this class that extends that class, where you take a generic item and you turn it into a produce item, extend it to a produce item where it has a name, a quantity, and also has an expiration date, and then adds and overrides some methods. So we've got these two different types of products, of items that we want to keep, that we might have inventory in some particular store. And I went ahead and wrote some code over here. Okay, now this is again just a simple little example where we're just making a few objects, but this code could be used in real whatever grocery store chains. They'd write code like this or something where they're keeping track of all these different types of items, and they'd have thousands and thousands of items that are being created in some application that uses it's interactive and uses scanners and input from users and things. But this keeps it simple. So hopefully this can help you just focus on the concepts in the code. So I've created a few items. I've created a couple of produce items for spinach and squash with some quantities in inventory, and I created a couple of generic items for gloves and boots with their quantities. So what I want you to do is see if you can figure out how to fill in all of this code, or at least this line first. So if we want to create a list of items, or you could call this whatever you wanted to, the entire inventory, some list where we want to keep track of all of these items in one list, okay, in one array list, what would I do here? What would I fill in here and here? So I want you to think about that first. What actually goes in those, in between the angle braces, angle brackets? And then once we have added all the items to the list, so maybe I'll add something else in here. So how do you add the items to the list? Okay, I'll fill that in just a minute. And once we've added all of these items up above to our items list, then we want to iterate over all of those items and talk about which methods we can call. As we're going through all and looking at all those items in the list, what methods can we call? So why don't you first figure out what goes in here and here, and then second, see if you can figure out what code you would need to write to actually add all four of these items to that list. So go ahead and pause the video, try that, and then I'll go through the answer to those parts. Okay, so we want to make this an array list of the more general class, again the base class, because we can assign objects of this type to a list that stores base class type reference variables. So just like we did before, we would put the base class in here, generic item. Oops. And we do the same thing over here. Okay. So our array list is going to hold generic items, and that means that it can hold items of this type, but it can also hold objects or references to objects of this type, because it can refer to derived class objects. Okay, so now if we want to add the items to the list, we just use the add method on the items list. So we would just say items.add, and we'll add all four of them. It doesn't really matter what order we add them, but we'd first add, if we want to add P1, our produce item up here, to the list, that would add it to the array list. And we do the same thing with the other three items. So G1 and P2 and G2. Okay, so we've added those items to the list, and now they're all in the array list. And now I want you to think about this next thing. So now if I want to iterate over all items in the list, that means we're going to go through in a loop and visit each of those four items that we added and do something with them. So what I want you to do is figure out what would we do here, what would we fill in that blank. So in other words, I want to go get, oops, this shouldn't say 0, it should say 1. So I want to go get the item, that's in slot 0 first, and then it's going to be 1, and then 2, and then 3. So as we go through this loop, we're going to get item 0, which is going to be P1, and then we're going to get item 1, which is going to be G1, and so on and so forth. So what do we write here for our type? What is item going to be? What type of variable is it going to be? And then once we get that, which methods can we call on that item? So pause the video again, see if you can figure out what goes here, and then answer what methods could we actually call on that reference called item. Okay, so we are going to go through, and again, this list holds items or objects of both types. It holds items of objects of both type, but it holds references to generic items. So I'm going to say generic item here, ITM, because that is the actual reference type that is stored in the list. So it's a list of generic item references, and so when I go get an item out of it, okay, I'm getting a reference to a generic item. So once we know that, then we know which methods can be called, because we said that the reference type, okay, not the object type, but the reference type here, determines which methods can be called or what methods can be called. So the only methods that could be called on this now are set name, set quantity, or print item. So I could say something like this, ITM dot set quantity, if we wanted to go through all of these objects or every single one of these items and say, you know, we got a bunch of stock in, the quantity is 10 on all of them now. Whoops, we could do something like that. I could say item set quantity 10, that would actually increase the quantity of all of these to 10, or I could do the same thing with print item or set name right here. So I could say print item on all of these like this, and that would go through and print the details for all the items. So then the last question is, which version of print item gets called? Is it this one right here, or is it this one, or does it depend? So think about that as it's going through the list of all of these objects in the list, which version of print item is going to get called. Okay, and hopefully this is where you get this concept that it's the object type that's being referred to that determines which of these methods gets called. So when it's looking at the first object right here, P1, which is a produce item, it's going to actually print this. It's going to print out the item name, quantity, and the expiration date. Then it goes to G1, which is a generic item, so it's going to call this version and just print out the item name and quantity. Then it's going to go to P2, and it's going to print all of the information, item name, item quantity, and expiration date. And then it's going to go to G2 the fourth time through the loop, and it's going to call this version and just print item name, item quantity. And that again is the whole point of being able to do this. That's polymorphism. You have different types of objects, you're calling the same method on them, but the actual different versions, or the polymorphism comes in, the morphing, the changing, it changes. Which version of the method gets called changes depending upon what the actual object is that's being referred to at that particular moment.